There's a white oak tree standing in a Georgia swamp right now that is older than the United States Constitution. Its trunk is 4 feet thick, its limbs twist outward at impossible angles, hardened by 2 centuries of salt, wind, and hurricanes. And if you walked up to that tree in 1794, you would not see a tree at all. You would see a warship. Not metaphorically, literally. A shipwright from Boston could stand at the edge of that swamp, squint at a live oak, and tell you exactly which part of a frigate each branch would become. That curved limb, a stern knee, that twisted fork, a hull frame, that massive trunk, the keel itself. Before there were shipyards, before there were sawmills, before there were even roads to carry timber out of the forest, American ships were designed in reverse. The ship did not dictate the shape of the wood. The wood dictated the shape of the ship. And that meant shipwrights had to find trees that had already grown into the parts they needed. Think about that for a moment. Every curve in a wooden warship's hull, every angled brace, every structural knee had to match a tree that grew that exact shape somewhere in the American wilderness, and someone had to go find it. This is the story of how the United States Navy was born not in shipyards, but in ancient forests. How men walked hundreds of miles through swamps and mountains searching for trees that had spent centuries growing into the shape of a frigate's ribs. How they felled giants that had been alive since before Columbus and dragged them through impossible terrain using nothing but oxen, muscle, and a tolerance for death that we cannot imagine today. And this is the story of what we lost in the process. Not just the trees, the men. To understand how America built ships from living forests, you first have to understand what those forests look like before we touch them. In 1790, the eastern seaboard of North America contained the largest concentration of shipbuilding timber on Earth, and most of it had never been cut. Start in Maine. The white pine forests there contain trees that modern Americans have simply never seen. We are not talking about the pines you see in state parks today. We are talking about trees that stood over 200 feet tall, on trunks so straight and so thick that a single tree could provide a mast for a Royal Navy ship of the line. Trees that had been growing since the Crusades. The British called these the King's Pines, and they wanted every single one of them. Here is the thing about wooden sailing ships that changes how you see them. The mast was the hardest part to source. Everything else on a ship could be assembled from smaller pieces, joined together with iron and pitch and prayer. But the mast had to be one solid trunk, one continuous piece of wood, sometimes over 100 feet long, strong enough to hold thousands of square feet of sail in a North Atlantic gale. There were almost no trees in Europe that could do this. Centuries of shipbuilding had stripped the continent. The few remaining giants were in Scandinavia and Russia, and getting timber from those places was expensive, unreliable, and often blocked by wars. But in the American colonies, white pines grew to heights that made European foresters weep, and the British Crown claimed them all. Royal surveyors walked through the Maine woods marking trees with the broad arrow, a symbol that looked like a crow's foot carved into the bark. Any tree bearing that mark belonged to the king. Cutting one down without permission was a crime punishable by imprisonment. The colonists, as you might imagine, did not appreciate this. But the white pine was only part of the equation. For masts, yes, which the pine was essential, but for the hull itself, for the structural bones of a ship that would absorb cannon fire and survive decades at sea, you needed something else entirely. You needed live oak. Live oak is not like other oaks. If you have only seen the oaks of the Midwest or the Northeast, with their tall, straight trunks and their autumn colors, you do not know what live oak is. Live oak grows low. It grows twisted. It grows outward more than upward. Its massive limbs reaching horizontally for 50 feet in every direction, sometimes so heavy they rest on the ground itself. A mature live oak looks less like a tree and more like a giant frozen in mid-explosion. And it is the densest, hardest wood in North America. A cubic foot of white oak weighs about 45 pounds. A cubic foot of live oak weighs nearly 75. It is so dense it barely floats. It is so hard that shipwrights in the 1790s complained their tools went dull after cutting just a few pieces. Iron axes bounced off it. Steel saws overheated and warped. But that same density made it nearly impervious to cannon fire. While European warships built from common oak would splinter into lethal shrapnel when hit by enemy balls, live oak absorbed the impact. The wood crushed inward instead of exploding outward. Cannonballs embedded themselves in the hull and simply stopped. The USS Constitution, launched in 1797, was built primarily from live oak harvested on St. Simon's Island, Georgia. During the War of 1812, British cannonballs bounced off her hull so consistently that sailors watched them splash harmlessly into the sea. That is where the nickname came from, Old Ironsides. Not because she had iron plating. She did not. She earned that name because her live oak hull behaved like iron. But here is the problem with live oak. Those same twisted, horizontal branches that made the wood so valuable also made the trees nearly impossible to work with using traditional forestry. A white pine grows straight. You cut it down, debark it, maybe trim the ends, and you have a usable mass timber. The tree essentially grows in the shape you need. Live oak grows in the shape of chaos. No two trees are alike. Every branch curves differently. Every trunk forks at a different angle. To build a ship from live oak, you could not simply harvest trees and then shape them in a shipyard. You had to find trees that had already grown into the shapes you needed, and that meant sending men into the coastal swamps of Georgia, Florida, and Louisiana to hunt for timber the way other men hunted for deer. They were called timber cruisers, and their job was one of the strangest in American history. A timber cruiser for the early U.S. Navy would receive a set of wooden templates called molds. These molds represented every curved structural piece needed for a specific ship design: a stem piece that formed the bow, a stern post that anchored the rudder, futtocks that formed the curved ribs of the hull, knees that braced the deck beams to the hull frames, dozens of oddly shaped pieces, each with specific dimensions, each with curves that had to match exactly. The cruiser's job was to walk into the forest with these molds and find trees that matched them. Imagine standing at the edge of a Georgia swamp in August. The heat is suffocating. The humidity is so thick you feel like you are breathing water. Mosquitoes swarm in clouds so dense they blacken the air. The ground beneath your feet is not solid. It is a mat of decaying vegetation floating on black water, and every step might plunge you thigh-deep into muck that smells like death. And somewhere in this swamp, hidden among thousands of acres of live oaks, are the trees you need. Or trees whose branches curve at exactly the right angle, trees whose limbs fork at exactly the right spread, trees that grew, by pure accident, into the shape of a ship's knee, or a hull frame or a stem piece. You have to find them. Timber cruisers would spend months in these swamps. They carried their molds on their backs, along with enough food to survive weeks between resupply. They waded through water up to their waists. They slept in the open, knowing that the same swamps harbored alligators, water moccasins, and clouds of biting insects that carried fevers with no known cure. And when they found a promising tree, they could not simply look at it and know. They had to climb it. They had to hold their wooden molds against the living bark, measuring angles and curves, determining whether this particular limb, still attached to a living tree still rooted in the swamp, would become part of an American warship. Most trees failed. A limb might curve correctly for the first few feet and then veer off at the wrong angle. A fork might have the right spread but the wrong thickness. The wood inside might be rotten, eaten by insects, or compromised by a wound that happened before the nation was born. When a cruiser found a match, he would mark the tree with paint or blazes. He would record its location as precisely as possible in a landscape with no roads, no landmarks, and no maps. He would note which specific branches matched which specific templates, and then he would move on, deeper into the swamp, searching for the next piece of a ship that did not exist yet. Finding the trees was only the beginning. Cutting them down was another matter entirely. Live oak does not fall like other trees. Its density works against you. An axe blade that would bite deep into pine or even white oak barely dents live oak's surface. The wood is so hard that steel edges roll and chip. Sawing live oak generates so much friction that saw blades overheat and lose their temper, going soft and useless. And the shape of the trees made felling dangerous in ways that straight trunk trees are not. When you cut a white pine, you know where it will fall. The tree is tall and relatively narrow. You cut a notch on one side, then saw through from the other, and the tree falls in the direction of the notch. Physics is your friend. Gravity is predictable. Live oak physics are treacherous. Much of the tree is often wider than it is tall. Its massive horizontal limbs, some weighing tons, create unpredictable weight distribution. As you cut, the tree does not simply lean in one direction. It may shift suddenly as internal stresses release. A limb that was stable while connected might twist as it separates, swinging with thousands of pounds of force in directions no one anticipated. Men died under falling live oak. They died when limbs snapped unexpectedly. They died when trees twisted as they fell, catching workers who thought they were standing in safe positions. They died when the dense wood fell faster than they could run, because unlike softer woods that slow their descent through air resistance, live oak drops like stone. And once the tree was down, the real labor began. A single live oak, felled for ship timber, might weigh 20,000 pounds. It was not going anywhere under its own power. And the swamps where these trees grew had no roads. Many of them had no solid ground at all. The solution was oxen. Teams of 12, 16, sometimes 20 oxen would be driven into the swamp to drag the timber out. But first, paths had to be cut. Not just cleared of brush, but built. Corduroy roads, made by laying logs crosswise over the mud to create a surface that would bear weight. These roads might stretch for miles through the swamp, each log placed by hand. Each section built specifically to move one piece of timber. The oxen teams worked in conditions that killed animals almost as reliably as they killed men. The swamps were infested with insects that tormented the beasts until their hides ran with blood. The footing was treacherous. Oxen broke legs in hidden holes and had to be slaughtered where they fell. The humidity rotted the leather harnesses until they snapped under strain, sending tons of timber rolling back toward workers who had no time to escape. And even when the timber reached solid ground, the journey was only beginning. The Constitution was built in Boston. Her live oak came from Georgia, over 1,000 miles away. There were no railroads. There were barely any roads at all, and certainly none capable of carrying timbers that weighed 10 tons. The only way to move ship timber from the southern forests to the northern shipyards was by water. First, the timber had to reach the coast. In some cases, this meant loading it onto barges and floating it down rivers like the Altamaha or the St. John's. Rivers that were shallow, full of sandbars, prone to flooding in spring and drought in summer. Rivers where a barge full of irreplaceable ship timber might ground on a hidden obstruction and sit for weeks waiting for water levels to rise. In other cases, the timber had to be hauled overland to a port. This meant more oxen teams, more corduroy roads, and more men straining at ropes and levers to maneuver 20-ton logs around obstacles. It meant swamp crossings where entire teams of animals might bog down so deep they had to be abandoned. It meant river fords where currents could sweep away the cargo that represented months of work. Once at the coast, the timber was loaded onto ships, small coastal vessels at first, carrying partial loads to collection points, then larger ships for the long voyage north. On ships that themselves were vulnerable to storms, to groundings, to the simple bad luck of a wooden vessel at sea. Some of the timber that went into old Ironsides spent more than a year in transit. Cut in 1794, it did not reach Boston until 1796. Men who felled those trees never saw the ship they built. They were dead of fever or accident, or simply moved on to other work by the time the Constitution slid down the ways. Let us talk about the shipyard itself, because the forests were only the first killing ground. Boston in the 1790s was one of the great shipbuilding centers of the world. The harbor was lined with yards where ships took shape on massive wooden frameworks called ways. And in those yards, a ship like the Constitution required the labor of hundreds of men working for years. The men who built ships were not interchangeable laborers. They were specialists, shipwrights who understood the complex geometry of wooden hulls, shoejoiners who fitted planks so tightly that caulking was almost unnecessary, blacksmiths who forged the thousands of iron bolts, brackets, and fittings that held the ship together, rope makers who twisted miles of hemp into rigging, sail makers who cut and stitched acres of canvas, and every one of them worked in conditions that modern safety regulations would consider criminal. Start with the live oak. When it arrived at the shipyard, it had to be shaped. And shaping wood this hard required tools that were not designed for it. Axes and adzes struck the surface and bounced back with force that broke wrists and dislocated shoulders. Men leaned into their work with chisels, applying their full body weight, and when the chisel suddenly bit deeper than expected, they fell forward onto blades or into the work itself. The sawyers who cut the timber into planks worked in saw pits. One man stood above, one man stood below, and together they pulled a massive ripsaw through logs that might be 3 feet thick. The man in the pit breathed sawdust until his lungs filled with fiber. He stood in accumulating debris that buried him to his knees. He could not see the blade above him, trusting completely that his partner would not misjudge a stroke and send steel through his skull. Caulking the hull meant driving oakum, a fiber made from old rope, into the seams between planks. Caulkers hammered iron tools for hours, and the repetitive impact destroying the joints in their hands and wrists until they could barely grip their tools. The pitch that sealed the oakum was heated in open cauldrons until it liquefied, and men carried this boiling tar in ladles up scaffolding to brush it onto the hull. Spills meant burns that went to the bone. Tipping a cauldron meant death. The mast had to be stepped, which meant lifting a white pine trunk weighing several tons and lowering it through a hole in the deck into a socket at the very bottom of the hull. This was done with block and tackle, with ropes under unimaginable strain, with dozens of men hauling on lines while others guided the massive timber into position. A rope that broke under load became a whip of twisted hemp that could cut a man in half. A mast that shifted unexpectedly could crush everyone beneath it. And none of these men had insurance. None of them had pensions. None of them had medical care beyond what a ship's doctor might provide for wounds he could not imagine healing. When they were injured, they simply stopped working. When they died, someone else took their place. The yard itself was a landscape of hazards that we would find unrecognizable today. The ships were built on inclined wooden platforms called ways, tilted toward the water so that when the hull was complete, where it could slide downward into the harbor. Workers climbed these structures on scaffolding made from the same timber that would become the ship. Rough-hewn planks, sometimes rotten, sometimes wet with rain or spray, held together with rope lashings that frayed in the salt air. A fall from 50 feet onto hard-packed ground or into the harbor was common enough that the yards developed procedures for it, not for prevention, for retrieval. Men stationed at the waterline with boat hooks, other men ready to run for the surgeon. The assumption was not that falls could be stopped, but that bodies could be recovered. The fire danger was constant. Shipyards needed forges for metalwork, pitch kettles for caulking, braziers for bending planks with steam, open flames everywhere, surrounded by wood shavings and sawdust and oakum and tar. Ships burned on the ways before they ever touched water. Workers burned with them, trapped in the maze of scaffolding and half-built structure, and unable to find their way out before the flames found them. At night, the yards employed watchmen to patrol for fire. During the day, no one patrolled for anything. The work was too urgent. The deadlines were set by Congress, by naval commanders, by the relentless pressure of a nation trying to build a fleet before its enemies could exploit its weakness. Safety was a luxury that slowed the work, and the work could not be slowed. Consider the men who bent the hull planks. This was not a job. It was a physical ordeal that left permanent damage. A frigate's hull curves in 3 dimensions. The planks that form its skin must follow these curves exactly, but oak does not naturally bend, it must be forced. The traditional method was steam bending. The planks were placed in long boxes filled with hot steam until the wood fibers softened. Then the planks were wrestled out of the steam box and clamped against the hull frames while the wood was still pliable, before it could cool and harden. This had to be done fast. Steam-softened wood begins to set within minutes. The workers had to carry planks that weighed hundreds of pounds, still hot enough to raise blisters, and muscle them into position against curves that fought every inch of movement. They worked with their bare hands because gloves were too clumsy. They worked in crews of 4 or 6 or 8, coordinating through shouted commands in a yard full of hammering and sawing and the hiss of steam. Get it wrong, and the plank cracked. Get it wrong badly, and the plank snapped while under tension, whipping back with enough force to break bones. Get it wrong worse, and the steam box exploded because someone let the water boil dry, showering workers with scalding vapor and splintered wood. The men who survived steam bending carried scars for life, burn marks on their arms and hands, joints that ached whenever weather changed, damaged by the combination of heat and violent strain. They were usually done by 40. Their bodies simply wore out, used up by the process of making oak pliable. And these were the skilled workers, the ones who had learned a trade, who commanded higher wages, who had some small measure of job security because their skills were not easily replaced. Below them were the laborers, the men who carried timber and hauled ropes and cleared debris and did whatever grunt work the yard required. They were paid by the day, they were replaced without comment. Their names do not appear in any record except occasionally in death notices that list cause of accident without describing what the accident was. A man crushed by a falling timber. A man drowned when a barge overturned. A man dead of unknown fever. These were the entries. Nothing about who they were, where they came from, whether anyone mourned them. Just a notation that the position was now open and another worker would be hired tomorrow. Here is what the records do not tell us. We know that Joshua Humphreys designed the Constitution. We know that George Claghorn supervised her construction. We know the names of the naval officers who would command her and the politicians who approved her funding. We do not know the names of the men who died building her. The shipyard records that survive are remarkably detailed about materials. We know how many pounds of copper went into her hull sheathing. We know the dimensions of every mast and spar. We know the exact specifications of her anchor chains, but the men who cut the timber, who dragged it from the swamps, who shaped it with their hands in the Boston yards, they appear in the records as line items. So many workers hired on such a date. So many wages paid on such a date. Their names are missing, their histories erased, with no accounting of which ones went home whole and which ones did not go home at all. This is not an accident of history. This is how we chose to remember. The Constitution is a national treasure. She floats in Boston Harbor to this day, the oldest commissioned warship still afloat. Visitors walk her decks and marvel at her craftsmanship. They learn about her victories against the British, about the cannonballs that bounced off her hull, about the nickname that made her legend. They do not learn about the men who fell under live oaks in Georgia swamps. They do not learn about the sawyers who breathed wood fiber until their lungs gave out. They do not learn about the workers who burned, who were crushed, who simply disappeared from the records between one pay date and the next. We preserved the ship. We forgot the cost. The Constitution was not unique. She was simply the most famous example of a process that built the entire early American fleet. Between 1794 and 1800, the United States constructed 6 original frigates to form the core of its navy. The Constitution, the United States, the President, the Constellation, and the Congress, and the Chesapeake. Every one of them built primarily from live oak harvested in the coastal swamps of the South. And after the original 6, the demand only grew. The War of 1812 required ships. The Barbary Wars required ships. The protection of American merchant vessels required ships. Every frigate, every sloop of war, every gunboat that flew the American flag was built from timber that men had walked into the wilderness to find. By the 1820s, the easily accessible live oak was gone, not cut, claimed. The Navy Department realized that the supply of this irreplaceable timber was finite, and they began buying up entire coastal islands specifically to preserve their live oak. St. Simon's Island, Cumberland Island, portions of the Florida coast. These became naval timber reserves, forests set aside not for conservation in our modern sense, but for future consumption. The Navy sent survey teams to catalog every usable tree. They drew maps showing the location of oaks with the specific curves needed for specific ship components. They calculated how many frigates the remaining forest could supply. The answer was not reassuring. Live oak takes centuries to reach shipbuilding size. A tree that might produce hull frames in 1820 would have been a seedling when Columbus sailed. The Navy was harvesting trees that would not be replaced in any human time frame. Every ship built was a withdrawal from a bank account that could not be replenished. And still they built, because the alternative was a navy of imported timber, dependent on foreign sources, vulnerable to embargo and war. The forest had to be sacrificed. That was the calculation. Walk through the coastal southeast today and you will still find live oaks. They stand in parks and private estates, their massive limbs draped with Spanish moss. Their shapes exactly as twisted and horizontal as they were 2 centuries ago. But you will not find the giants. The trees that remain are survivors of the Great Harvest. They were too young in 1800, too small, too difficult to reach, or simply lucky, growing on land that no timber cruiser ever walked. The true giants are gone. Trees that had been growing since the medieval period, trees that had weathered 500 years of hurricanes, on trees that had achieved shapes so massive and so complex that a single one might yield 20 ship components, all of them reduced to planks and frames, built into ships that rotted or burned or were broken up for scrap within decades. A few of those ships still exist. The Constitution, preserved through continuous restoration. A few others as museum pieces or archaeological sites, but the forests that built them do not exist. They cannot exist again. Not in any time frame that matters to human planning, not in centuries, not in millennia. What we built from those forests, we built once. There will be no second harvest. The scale of what was destroyed is difficult to comprehend because we have nothing to compare it to. When European settlers first reached the Georgia and Florida coasts, they encountered live oak forests that stretched for miles in every direction. Trees so densely packed that the canopy blocked out the sun entirely. On trunks so thick that 8 men joining hands could not encircle them. Limbs so heavy they bent to the ground and rooted again, creating mazes of living wood that seemed to have no beginning and no end. The indigenous peoples who lived among these trees had names for individual oaks. They knew which trees had been standing when their great-great-grandparents were born. They oriented their communities around the ancient ones, building villages in their shade, so burying their dead beneath their roots. The trees were landmarks, meeting places, sacred sites. They were, in a sense, the oldest residents. The shipbuilders did not see residents. They saw material. Within 30 years of concentrated harvesting, the accessible live oak was gone. Trees that had been growing since before the Norman conquest were reduced to stumps. Forests that had covered islands from the waterline to the interior were stripped to mud and scrub. What had taken 1,000 years to grow was erased in a single generation. And it was not just the live oak. The white pine forests of Maine, those towering stands of trees marked with the King's broad arrow, fared no better under American ownership than they had under British. The Revolution removed the Crown's monopoly, but it did not remove the demand. Instead, it intensified. Now any American entrepreneur could harvest ship timber. Now any sawmill could cut masts. The race was on to take everything that could be taken before competitors took it first. By 1820, the great white pines were functionally extinct as a shipbuilding resource. Individual trees remained in remote areas, but the continuous forest that had supplied mass for 2 centuries of Atlantic shipping was gone. Logged out, converted to lumber and sold, or burned to clear farmland, or simply wasted because there was no infrastructure to transport the fallen timber before it rotted. We are told that America was built on the principle of endless abundance. The land was vast. The resources were inexhaustible. There would always be more trees, more timber, more of everything waiting to be claimed. This was never true. It was a story we told ourselves to justify taking without thinking. and the white pine and live oak forests were among the first proofs that the story was a lie. The transition away from wooden shipbuilding came not because we ran out of timber, though we were getting close. It came because of iron. By the 1850s, the technology of steam-powered iron ships had advanced to the point where wooden warships were becoming obsolete. The Civil War demonstrated this conclusively. When the ironclad CSS Virginia steamed into Hampton Roads and smashed a fleet of wooden Union ships without taking damage, the era of timber warships effectively ended. Within a generation, once the live oak reserves that the Navy had so carefully preserved became irrelevant. The islands were sold off, the timber surveys abandoned, the entire infrastructure of wooden shipbuilding allowed to decay. Some of the old shipwrights lived long enough to see this happen. Men who had spent their lives learning to read the curves of trees, to shape oak with hand tools, to build vessels that could survive the open ocean. Their skills became curiosities, then memories, then nothing at all. The last of them died with knowledge that had taken generations to accumulate. How to select compass timber, how to tell by the bark whether the wood beneath was sound, how to bend a plank into a curve using steam and pressure and patience. All of it gone because iron ships did not need it. This is how specialized knowledge dies, not through suppression or destruction, but through obsolescence. The world moves on, and the old ways simply stop being transmitted from master to apprentice. There is a tendency, when we talk about the past, to treat progress as inevitable and its cost as acceptable. We needed ships. The ships needed timber. The timber had to come from somewhere, and it had to be cut by someone. All of this is true. The early American Navy protected commerce, established the nation's sovereignty, and projected power in a world where power mattered. But acknowledging necessity is not the same as erasing cost. As the men who died in the Georgia swamps did not die for abstractions. They died for wages. A few dollars a month, paid irregularly, often withheld for equipment damage or lost time. They died not knowing that the ships they built would become legendary. Most of them never saw those ships at all. They saw mosquitoes and mud and the endless work of turning trees into timber. The men who died in the shipyards did not die for glory. They died because safety was expensive and workers were cheap. Because there was always someone else willing to stand in the saw pit, always another pair of hands to swing a caulking mallet, always another body to replace the one that fell from the scaffolding. We call the Constitution a national treasure. We do not call the men who built her anything at all because we do not know their names. This is the debt we do not discuss. Every plank in that hull was cut by someone who left no record. Every frame was shaped by hands that are now dust. Every fitting was forged by a blacksmith who breathed iron dust until his lungs turned to stone. They built a ship that lasted 2 centuries. Most of them did not last 40 years. If you visit the Constitution today, you will see a ship that has been rebuilt many times. The original timber is largely gone, replaced piece by piece as the old wood rotted or failed. This is not a criticism. It is simply how wooden ships survive. They are renewed until they become a different collection of atoms shaped like the original. But there is still live oak in her. Pieces that date to the original construction, cut from trees in Georgia swamps before the turn of the 19th century. Wood that was growing when the Revolution was fought, when the Constitution was written, when the nation itself was just an idea. Touch that wood if you can. Put your hand on the hull and understand what you are touching. You are touching a tree that grew for centuries without knowing it was growing into a shape that would stop cannonballs. You are touching the labor of men who will never be named, who dragged this timber through swamps and shaped it with bleeding hands. You are touching a piece of a forest that no longer exists, harvested so thoroughly that its like will never be seen again. You are touching the cost of a nation. The forests are gone, the men are gone, the skills are gone. What remains is the ship, and the question of what we choose to remember. We can tell the story of old Ironsides as a tale of triumph. The ingenious design, the impervious hull, the battles won. All of that is true. All of that is worth celebrating. But we can also tell a different story. A story about the forests that existed before we were a nation, trees older than European memory of this continent. A story about men who walked into those forests with templates on their backs, searching for wood that had accidentally grown into the shape of war. A story about the brutal labor of extraction, the lives traded for timber, the invisible sacrifice that made the visible triumph possible. Both stories are true, but only one gets told in the museum. The live oaks that remain are protected now. Some of them are descendants of the shipbuilding trees, grown from acorns that fell in the 1700s. In another few centuries, they might reach the size their ancestors achieved. They might develop those twisting, horizontal branches that made the old growth so valuable. But there will be no ships built from them. The art is lost. The need is gone. The trees will grow and die and be replaced by other trees, and no one will ever again look at a live oak and see a frigate taking shape. This is what we mean when we talk about progress. The old things become unnecessary, and then they become impossible, and finally they become unimaginable. Our grandchildren will not be able to conceive of building a warship from living trees, because the world in which such a thing made sense will be as foreign to them as the Roman Empire. All that will remain is the ship, and the story we choose to tell about it. I want you to do something after this video. Look up a photograph of the Constitution. Not a painting, a photograph. Something that shows the texture of the wood, the way the planks fit together, the massive curves of the hull. And then imagine working backward. Imagine those planks as part of a tree. Imagine that tree standing in a swamp, its limbs reaching outward, its shape already containing the ship that would be cut from it. Imagine the man who found that tree, who held a wooden template against the bark and saw what no one else could see. Imagine the axe biting into wood harder than any other in America. Imagine the teams of oxen straining against chains and dragging tons of timber through mud that swallowed everything. Imagine the barge trip down some coastal river, the months at sea heading north, the arrival in a yard where men were waiting. Imagine the sawyers in their pit, breathing dust, pulling a blade through oak so dense it broke their tools. Imagine the caulkers, the pitch carriers, the riggers working 100 feet in the air with nothing between them and death but their grip. Imagine all of them. Then look at the ship again. What you are seeing is not wood. It is labor, it is sacrifice, it is 1,000 decisions, 1,000,000 hours of work, an uncountable number of risks taken by men who had no choice but to take them. The ship floats because the trees grew. The trees became timber because men walked into swamps to find them. The timber became a ship because other men shaped it with their hands. And some of those men never walked out of the swamps, never left the shipyards, never saw the vessel they died building. This is how America built ships from trees still growing in the forest. And this is what it cost. If you made it this far, you understand something that gets left out of every museum tour. That the things we inherit, the ships, and the buildings and the institutions were not free. They were purchased with labor and risk and lives by people who have been erased from the story. The Constitution sails on. The men who built her do not. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. The history that gets left out, the cost that gets forgotten. I will see you in the next one.